Italian, but I'll speak in English and I'll speak slowly. I hope clearly. In some parts I might just summarize because my paper might be too long. But the Jesuit philosopher and theologian Francisco Suárez lived during a time when there was much discussion over the natural rights of unbelievers. In the 1500s, the Dominican Bartolomé de las Casas and Francisco de Vitoria had already defended the natural rights of the American Indians who suffered abuse on the part of some of the Spanish conquistadors. Suárez likewise defended the natural rights of the Indians, and he strongly opposed any attempts to enslave them or force them to convert to the Catholic faith. Suárez, though, also considered the rights of non-Christians such as Jews and Muslims living under Christian rule. Suárez believed that all human beings must obey the natural law, which is the law of God that can be known by natural reason and is written in the human heart, or as in De Legibus lex naturalis in homine est, non est scripta in tabulis, sed in corte. As a Catholic, though, he believed that the Church had the authority over the baptized, because the character of baptism is an indelible sign of subjugation to the Church. So, character baptismi est indelibile signum subjugationes ad ecclesiam. Now, Suárez, like Bellarmine, did not believe that the Roman pontiff had direct temporal power over the whole world. But he did believe the Pope had supreme spiritual power. Professor Calafante already addressed this. Had supreme spiritual power over the whole world because Christ had bestowed upon Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven, which signified supreme spiritual power. Potestatem spiritualem supremum. And spiritual jurisdiction in all things. Suárez, though, was aware that the universal spiritual jurisdiction of the Roman pontiff did not apply in fact, de facto, to all, since not all belong to the Church. Quia non omnes sunt de ecclesia. He believed, though, that the ideal arrangement was for the state to support the Catholic Church, which is the true religion. Suárez lived during a time different from our own. The historian Brad Gregory notes that the understanding of religious freedom we now have, quote, contrasts sharply with the confessional regimes of early modern Europe, in which allied political and ecclesiastical authorities prescribed specific forms of Christian worship and prohibited others. Cuius regio, cuius religio, or eus religio. Given that Suárez wanted states to be Catholic, the question needs to be raised, what about non-Christians and non-Catholics living in a confessional Catholic state? Do they have any freedom under the natural law? In his treatise De Fide, Spe et Caritate, published in 1622, 5 years after his death, Suárez elaborates on the differences between apostasy, infidelity, and heresy. Apostasy requires that the faith already received be deserted. Apostasy, therefore, would occur if someone were to abandon Christianity for Judaism or paganism. Apostasy, however, is not a species of infidelity or of heresy. It's a type of infidelity, but in itself it's not a species of infidelity. Apostasy also is not the same as heresy, since, following the common opinion of the Fathers, a heretic retains the Christian confession, but in a corrupted form. Infidelity refers to those who are not Christians and have never been Christians. So this would be Jews, Muslims, Hindus, others who have never been Christian. But he doesn't believe that all the non-Christians are the same. he says there are three orders of infidels, tres ordines infidelium. The first order consists of those to whom the faith was sufficiently announced and proposed, but refuse to believe. According to Suárez here, there's no question of culpability, for they have no excuse if the faith was proposed to them sufficiently to believe. But then there's the second group of infidels, made up of those who have never heard anything of the faith, who have heard nothing of the faith, neither sufficiently nor insufficiently, neither by preaching nor rumor or report. And basically he says they're not culpable. They'll have to be judged before God by the natural law. But then the third group consists of infidels who have heard something of the Christian faith, either by report or rumor, but not in a sufficient manner. And he includes among this third group Turks, Muslims, and those in the provinces of India. So he's saying they've heard something of the Christian faith, but not in a way that would compel them to convert. Now, I have a section here on culpability and whether or not non-Christians could be saved, go to heaven. And basically what he says is something that had already been anticipated by Vittoria and Tommaso de Vio, Cajetan, that if they had invincible ignorance, that is, there's no guilt for rejecting the Christian faith or the Catholic faith, but they can incur guilt against the natural law, since all human beings are to follow the natural law, the law of God that can be known by natural reason. And non-Christians who have heard something of the true faith should pray to God for divine illumination and abstain from sin. They also have an obligation to seek the full truth. But Suárez says it's always important to keep in mind the principle that God does not deny grace to one who does with all within his power. Facienti quad in se est Deus non denegat gratiam. So he doesn't deny grace to those who do with all that's in their power. Now, should non-Christians or infidels be granted religious freedom in Catholic states? In other words, can Catholics then tolerate having Jews or Muslims and others living in a Catholic state? Following what has already been said, he did not believe a Catholic state could force infidels to convert, because the temporal power of the state is ordered to a natural end. Therefore, the state lacks the authority to punish subjects who do not accept the Catholic faith. Now, just make an aside, some people wonder, what about the Spanish Inquisition? But that was the case of the Los Conversos, those who had converted already. So once they converted, even if they did so under pressure, they were under the jurisdiction of the church and the Catholic state. But those Jews and Muslims who did not convert, no, the church did not have jurisdiction over them. But then after Isabel and Ferdinand asked the Jews and the Muslims to leave, well, then many of them feigned conversion in order to stay. Those were the targets, but they had converted. Well, in any case, what about those living who don't convert? Theoretically, he's speaking. Suárez was so committed to the principle of religious freedom that he believed that non-Christians would be justified in waging a just war against Catholic invaders who sought to convert them by force. He was very strong on this. He's following here Francisco de Vitoria, who had that wonderful line, bellum non est argumentum pro veritate fidei Christianae. War is no argument for the truth of the Christian faith. So Suárez was in that. You can't force people to believe. There's actually statements of popes earlier than this, or the Second Council of Nicaea regarding Jews. Jews cannot be forced to believe against their will. So it's not new, but it wasn't always followed. Suárez maintained it was not intrinsically evil, though, to use indirect means of inducing infidels to the Catholic faith, as long as their freedom from coercion was protected. He therefore believed it would be licit to compel non-Christians to listen to preaching about the Christian faith. That could be done. Suárez thought that Catholic rulers could allow the infidels freedom of worship within their realms as long as their forms of worship were not opposed to the natural law. So if it's some type of religion that opposes the natural law, their worship opposes the natural law, I suppose if they had human sacrifice or something, then they could be stopped. So he thought that the religious rights of the Jews and the Muslims could be tolerated in as much as they adore the one true God. Unum tantum verum Deum adorant. They adore the one true God. He includes both Jews and Muslims, the same here. So Christian rulers, however, could deprive infidels of their right to worship if their rights are opposed to the natural law. This is because secular rulers have the right to establish laws pertaining to the natural law. Now, just St. Thomas believed that toleration could be granted, St. Thomas Aquinas, to unbelievers, especially the Jews, since their rights foreshadow the Christian faith. But Suárez goes beyond Aquinas and he applies this same principle to the Muslims, at least theoretically, because they would worship the one God by natural reason. Now, with regard to religious freedom, or at least toleration for non-Catholic Christians living under Catholic rule, these are the Protestants, Suárez was more severe. He was more willing to grant it to the infidels or non-Christians than he was to the apostates or the heretics. This is because of that principle that baptism is an indelible sign of subjugation to the church. Because of their baptism, the Catholic Church had jurisdiction over the apostates and the heretics, even if the political situation made this authority difficult to enforce. In fact, Suárez believed that it was licit and holy to punish heretics and apostates from the faith and to compel them to come back to the church. He believed that children of apostates and heretics could be exempt from such punishments, but they still could be deprived of certain privileges. So by the time he's living, you have children, generations of those who are Protestant. Could they be held accountable or culpable for the heresies of their forefathers? And here he shows some toleration and some compassion. He said, with regard to children who were baptized by heretics, Suárez still believed the church had jurisdiction over them as long as their baptism is valid. If you're baptized, the church has jurisdiction over you. Okay? If they receive the character of the sacrament and they become members of the Catholic Church, even though their parents will raise them in separation from the Catholic Church. And Pope Benedict XIV, in a letter he writes to the Duke of York in 1749, actually quotes Suárez on this, that they become a member. Now, it is only after those children later accept the heresies in which they were raised that they could be considered outside of full Catholic unity. Because of their baptism, however, they are, at least theoretically, still subject to the Catholic Church's authority. Now, what could be done to these children, or speaking theoretically? Even though the children of heretics are still subject to the Catholic Church's authority, Suárez did not believe children should be punished for the sins of their parents. Here he cites St. Thomas Aquinas, the second part, question 108, Article 4. He points out that a person should not be punished for another's sins. And citing the book of Deuteronomy, do not kill the son on behalf of the father, non uccidere filius pro patre. Even though Suárez argues that the children of heretics are not necessarily culpable for the heresy of their parents, he nevertheless believes they are in a state of irregularity. So the church has jurisdiction over them. In a certain sense, they're members of the Catholic Church, but they accept heresies. So they're in an irregular irregular situation. So therefore, they can be subject to various restrictions for the sake of the common good of the Catholic regime. He maintains that they could be prohibited from assuming public office, as well as assuming religious clerical offices. They also can be deprived of certain benefices, though they can be allowed to retain those they already have. Suárez maintains that no other penalty should be inflicted on the children of heretics beyond the privations of public and ecclesiastical offices. So, in some ways, he shows the influence of St. Thomas Aquinas here. But regarding heretics, so St. Thomas Aquinas and later St. Robert Bellarmine believed they could be warned, and then if they don't abide by the warning, they could be arrested and turned over for execution. That was actually the belief. Suárez doesn't seem to really hold to this, though theoretically he believes it's possible. He preferred sparing the lives of heretics because punishment should be medicinal rather than vindictive. Ut poena non tantum sit vindicativa sed etiam medicinalis. So it should be more medicinal rather than vindictive. And he also was aware that some considered execution medicinal, but I haven't found that he supports this, as did Bellarmine. Now, what about his position? How much time do I have? 12 minutes? I'd like to move on to Suárez on forced religious conversions and international law. So Suárez, as we have seen, did not believe that the infidel, the non-Christians, could ever be forced to accept the Catholic faith. I think, from what I know, at least on paper, at least officially, that was the position of the Catholic Church, going back Gregory I, and the Second Council of Nicaea, 787. He thought that forcing someone to believe would be offensive to human freedom and to God, because true conversion is due to the efficacy of the divine word and the grace of God. Efficacia verbi divini et gratiae Dei, and not to human conversion. Also, forced conversions would likely lead to simulated conversions and innumerable sacrileges. Non-Christians would be scandalized by seeing their co-religionists forced to convert, and then they would be tempted to hate or blaspheme the Christian religion. Now, during the time of Suárez, there was much discussion over the possibility of salvation for non-believers. Now, this was intensified by the discovery of the Europeans of the Americas. Because here the native people of the Americas or their ancestors could not be held accountable for rejecting Christ and the church. But could they be saved? Their ancestors, the ones who never heard of the faith, and they had how many? Suárez affirmed the principle, which is actually scriptural, that God wishes all people to be saved. That is from 1 Timothy 2:4. God wishes all people to be saved. Deus vult omnes homines salvus fieri. Because God wishes all people to be saved, he also gives every human being sufficient proximate supernatural assistance. Suárez maintains that salvation is not possible without supernatural grace, and he cites Ephesians 2:8, for by my grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from you, it is the gift of God. But are the non-believers open, or can they receive supernatural grace? And Suárez here cites the letter to the Hebrews 11:6, without faith it is impossible to please God. Sine fide impossibile est placere Deo. However, he believes that faith can be either in reality or in wish, aut in re, aut in voto. The non-believer, therefore, who does within his power and is inculpably ignorant to the true faith, can be illumined by pure grace, ex pura gratia, and for Suárez, this illumination can be an expression of the desire for faith in voto. Now, he's aware of the principle that goes back to Saint Cyprian, but others have repeated it, extra ecclesiam non est salus. Extra ecclesiam, sometimes put nemo salvator, or non extra ecclesiam. Well, it's put in different ways, but this is the way Cyprian put it. Outside the church, there's no salvation. Suárez accepts this in principle, but he appeals to the distinction between belonging to the church in reality or in wish, in re vel in voto. Thus he states, no one can be saved who does not enter this church of Christ either in reality or at least in desire or wish. He finds support for this position in Bellarmine, and he also makes it clear that this desire to enter the church in voto is also a desire to be baptized in voto, since no one can enter the church without baptism. Non-Christians therefore should not be forced to accept the faith for the sake of their salvation. They should be, the gospel should be preached to them, but if they do not accept the faith, their ultimate destiny should be left to the judgment of God. That's what he seems to hold. Now, this affirmation of religious freedom for non-Christians is also based on his understanding of human rights. Relating a type of international law, or relating to international law, he sees, here he shows the influence of Francisco de Vitoria. And this natural law, which gives way to a kind of international law, is based upon a very important principle, which he lays out in De Legibus, Book 2, Chapter 19. And it is that all human beings, just by being human, share a type of kinship. And there's a kind of universal human community, even though human beings are divided into different countries. So this is what he writes. Although divided into various peoples and kingdoms, the human race always has a certain unity, which is not only that of a species, but also one that is political and moral, which the precept of mutual love and mercy proclaims, a precept that extends to all people, even to strangers and of any condition whatsoever. Hence, though each autonomous city, state, or kingdom is in itself a complete community and made up of its members, nonetheless, any one of them is also a member in some way of the world, insofar as it belongs to the human race. For these communities will never singly be so self-sufficient that they will not need mutual help and fellowship as well as communication, sometimes for a better mode of life and greater utility, sometimes indeed out of moral necessity and need, as the actual state of affairs makes clear. For this reason, they will need some law by which they can be directed and rightly ordered, and in this kind of communication and fellowship. So there should be a kind of international law following more the jus gentium, and also the natural law. But I would like to just bring this to conclusion. I have a few minutes? Yeah. Okay. I'd like to point out that Suárez's affirmation of religious freedom for non-believers, and I also may add the possibility of their salvation, is affirmed very explicitly in Vatican II of the Catholic Church. In the Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, we find an echo, or something similar to the thought of Suárez, when the Council states, this is 1965, the Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others within due limits. So against the idea of forcing people. Now, in terms of conclusion, according to Suárez, non-Christians are still to seek the true religion, but they cannot be forced to do so. They can be granted freedom of worship in Catholic regimes as long as their worship is not offensive to the natural law. Now, non-Christians as well as non-Catholic Christians can be subject to various restrictions within Catholic countries, but they can never be forced to enter the Catholic Church against their will. Now, in terms of these restrictions, probably that is something that we might say is dated or from his own era, his own period. But the idea, the theoretical affirmation of religious freedom and the possibility of salvation of non-Christians is something that would be affirmed or is affirmed in Vatican II. Now, he believed his attitude towards Protestants seems rather severe, but this is because he believed the state should support the true religion. And this explains his strong reaction to England's departure from the Catholic faith in Defensio Fidei, and his passionate protest against the persecution of Catholics under the English monarchs since the time of Henry VIII. Suárez's defense of religious freedom is grounded in both the natural law and his theological recognition of God's grace as the true agent of conversion to the Catholic faith. But he was a man of his times, but he also exemplifies a respect for human rights, human freedom, and the natural law, and I might add the international law that was part of the Iberian heritage of the 16th and 17th centuries. Thank you.